Chapter 17. Mind, a case of mistaken identity. The common model of consciousness here in the West is that man consists of a body and a mind. The former is seen as physical, while the latter is regarded as metaphysical, at least within spiritual traditions. The modern psychologist, seeking to define everything in the universe in materialistic terms, has attempted to view consciousness as a purely physical phenomenon, but he has been confounded by the fact that he cannot locate it in the brain. Some clarification is required. It is true that the mind is utterly dependent upon the physical brain. A person with Down syndrome will suffer a compromised personality. Alzheimer's disease hinders one from thinking straight. A head injury can result in memory loss. A knock sufficient enough to induce a coma will cause consciousness to cease altogether for a spell, as will an injection of anesthetic. Chemical substances such as caffeine, alcohol, and psychoactive drugs bring about temporary personality changes. The masculinity in a man's nature and the femininity in a woman's are due to a hormonal balance. The same is true of the differences between adult and child personalities. Furthermore, in the very early stages of our evolutionary history, we didn't even possess anything that you would realistically call a mind. We were nothing more than clumps of cells, mutating and replicating. The brain is a material thing that took billions of years to evolve into what it is today, and mind and brain are inseparable. Clearly, consciousness requires the brain in order to function. We've been able to identify the specific roles of various sections of the brain. An understandable assumption, then, is that consciousness is a component of the brain. Interestingly, it hasn't been found. The reality of subjective experience remains a profoundly weird phenomenon to explain, so tricky that science refers to it as the hard problem of consciousness. If we take what we know about the mind and seek to reproduce one artificially, we get a clearer sense of the difficulty facing the materialist in his attempt to find the core of himself. Consider the robotics toy Lego Mindstorms. We can create a body from blocks, implant a computer processor which can receive information from the physical world using a sensor, the same principle as our eyes. The processor interprets that information into a usable form that makes sense, just like our brain does with what our eyes see. The robot would even be able to perceive itself as an aspect of that environment, enabling it to move about and determine where it's going from where it has been. But it's not real consciousness. It's mere mimicry, a feedback loop with nothing at the center. The robot does not experience what you know so intimately as an I feeling. The robot's mind is merely blind, predictable electricity flowing through electronic logic gates. To say that this is the same in principle as consciousness is to say that consciousness doesn't exist. But you feel your own existence very keenly, don't you? And who or what is this mysterious you? The scientifically oriented Westerner does not like the fact that he cannot seem to locate, measure, and disassemble consciousness, so he has an unfortunate tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater, essentially declaring himself to be an automaton. Consciousness is a brain-generated illusion, he claims. Fortunately for me, this is not a position I need to waste much time refuting, because I don't believe in arguing with other illusions, and I don't know why illusions would want to argue with me. So, if we are going to argue, at least admit that the conscious activity of arguing is real, or disappear. If we say consciousness is an illusion, it can only be an illusion in the sense that we might refer to the material universe as illusory, meaning that the seemingly solid classical universe is more fundamentally a non-local universe. This does not mean that matter isn't real. It just means that the fundamental nature of matter isn't what sense perception informs us. Similarly, we should not claim that consciousness is unreal, for we will make liars out of ourselves every waking moment as we depend upon it. Declaring consciousness an illusion preserves a materialistic worldview, with all the I's dotted and the T's crossed, but the conclusion simply doesn't match experience. You feel conscious, whatever it is we mean by you. Something profoundly strange is peering out from behind your eyes, something that doesn't exist inside a robot or inside any artificial intelligence. I suspect it's the feeling part of this predicament that's hard, because the one-dimensional thinking of the material minimalist won't allow for anything that refuses to be neatly catalogued in rational language. Nevertheless, there it is. You are here. A less extreme conclusion than declaring consciousness an illusion is the anticipation that one day we will locate it within the brain. Experience tells us that consciousness is real, only currently not understood. This view may be accompanied by speculation that we will one day be able to create an artificial intelligence that is genuinely self-aware. But I'm confident we're never going to locate consciousness in the brain. Why not? Because the direction of this endeavour stems from a faulty model of the human organism, one that we unwittingly imbibed from our culture's Christian heritage. Mind-body dualism. The quest to make a computer conscious begins with the subtle presupposition that consciousness is a tangible entity made out of parts. But it's not, as I aim to show. In the Christian tradition, as well as many other spiritual traditions, and especially the philosophy of René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, the mind is viewed as an entity. Even if we call it a soul and consider it immaterial, it is still conceived of as an identifiable thing distinct from other things, just as much a component of the body as the heart or lungs. While on earth, this soul pilots the body, and when the body dies, the soul possibly continues. Although the modern rationalist is much more realistic about the nature of the mind, the subtle influence of our religious heritage often weighs in as a silent partner. We buy into mind-body dualism without realizing it, by continuing to look for the pilot of the vehicle. Surely the reason we can't find it is obvious. The model itself is wrong. Look what happens to this hypothetical pilot when a person is struck over the head and goes into a coma. The pilot does not continue to exist in a dark room consciously waiting for the body to recover. The pilot is simply not there. It has stopped existing entirely. And when sufficient physical healing has taken place, the pilot appears to pop back into existence. How odd! If you believe in an afterlife, you really must face up to how absent your hypothetical soul is at times during this life, never mind the next one. When you are in a coma, your soul's lack of presence is every bit as profound as it was before you were born. In fact, the phrase, "when you are in a coma," is nonsensical. There is no you having an experience called coma. A coma is pure non-experience. When you wake up, there is no memory of having gone somewhere. You were simply not there, and now you are there again. Let's imagine that your assailant looks at your unconscious body, checks your pulse, and says, "Oh, he's still alive. I can fix that." So he whacks you over the head a second time, dealing a fatal blow. At this point, does it seem likely that the pilot, which had already been rendered non-existent, would suddenly pop back into existence outside the body? Why would a soul be immortal when it can both be and not be during this life? Someone might object, it's quite a leap to say that souls don't exist just because they sleep and wake up. Notice that they sleep when the physical brain is injured. By the same reasoning, they would sleep permanently when the brain is terminally injured. I propose that whatever consciousness is, we should not view it as an entity, because entities do not flip in and out of existence. We are not a mind or soul piloting a vehicle, nor are we a pilotless vehicle. The solution does not have to be one or the other, because the whole foundation of the dilemma is in error, creating false alternatives. A much more rationally satisfying understanding of consciousness will become apparent once we dispense with the existing dualistic model. When the universe is understood as a unified field, we come to appreciate the world in front of our eyes as a vast sea of energy where nothing is separate from anything. Objects appear to be separate to our senses, but their fundamental essence is not so. Even when this esoteric perspective is grasped, there is still a tendency to view oneself as a separate observer of the universe. But if the universe is unified, there cannot be you and the universe. The unified field isn't unified if there's an entity called you separate from it. The only possible conclusion is either 1. There is no you after all, or 2. You are the universe itself, not a part of it. You're it. We naturally resist both options. The first denies the reality of our experience as conscious creatures. The second looks like egomania. Nevertheless, let option 2 simmer for a moment and see how it sits with you when augmented with the following considerations. Consciousness is not a tangible entity made of physical bits, because any arrangement of pieces is never anything more than an arrangement of pieces, each of which can be examined and its function identified. For instance, if I put various metals and plastics together in a particular way, I end up with a combustion engine. And if I build other metals and plastics around it in a certain manner, I have a car. But there are no actual entities called car and engine. There is only a functional arrangement of metals and plastics, which in turn are made of molecules, which in turn are made of subatomic particles. The only result you ever achieve from construction is utility, the performance of a function. In recognizing this, it suddenly becomes clear that consciousness is not a physical component of the brain, but the function of the brain, just as turning fossil fuel into motion is the function of a combustion engine. You would never say, where can I find the component called turning fossil fuel into motion within the engine? So consciousness is what the brain does, not what it is, not even a component of what it is. The function of anything is what occurs when its components work in harmony. The question, where do I find consciousness in the brain, is actually a nonsense question. It doesn't immediately look like nonsense because of a subtle trick that language plays upon us. Nouns are words referring to persons, places, or things. Note that consciousness is a noun. This unfortunately causes us to think of consciousness as a tangible entity separate from all other entities, requiring explanation as an entity. But what we really mean by consciousness is the feeling of being aware. A significant roadblock to a correct understanding of ourselves is the feeling that we ought to formulate our sense of self as a noun, an entity, a thing. I am a being, we think. But there really is nothing stopping you from viewing yourself as a verb, and it's much more rational. I am a doing. It sounds odd, but it's true. Nothing about you is stationary and unchanging. Physically, you age from moment to moment. Imagine an entire life from birth to death, sped up so that you see the body age in 10 seconds flat. Is that a being? It looks more like a doing. The mind is similarly changing over the course of a life. It's also a doing. We mistakenly believe we are beings because the process of change happens so slowly that we become attached to immediate experience. But nothing is truly being. It's all doing. Every lasting entity that you identify with a noun is really a process that is verbing away. The galaxy, the sun, the pyramids, life, awareness, all verbs masquerading as nouns. So let go of the need to define yourself as an entity. There are none. Many people think they possess an individual soul only because they inherited this particular idea through their culture and were never made aware of any alternative model of the mind-body relationship. Terms like mind, consciousness, and soul are so convenient to use in communication, and for most purposes they serve us effectively. But if we are to understand the nature of reality to a greater extent, we need to be aware of the subtle trap that language puts in our path, even though we must continue to use inaccurate words in communication. All nouns are, in a sense, problematic because they identify things in a universe where nothing is a thing in itself. What a noun really identifies is an object-environment contrast, a pattern standing out within a larger pattern. Things only make sense when perceived in relation to each other. This is true of everything in the universe. Can you have solids without space? No, because everything would be solid and thus formless. A solid is really a solid-space contrast. We don't notice this because we have a tendency to ignore the background. Can you have a single color without a color spectrum? No, because everything would be one color and thus indistinguishable. It's not even strictly true to say that red and orange are different colors. My computer is capable of displaying millions of different shades of color across the whole spectrum from white to black. When I identify red, this isn't just one out of several million. Red is part of a vaguely defined range of shades. If I move the slider on my photo editing software halfway between red and orange, then ask several individuals to identify the color, some might say red and others orange. Is it a reddish orange or an orangey red? There's really no distinct entity that I can label red. There is only the single spectrum of color and the labels we attach in order to quantify it. The more we try to isolate individual units of color, the more names we require for the different tones. Amaranth, Byzantium, periwinkle, viridian, to name just a few. How many real colors are there? Well, even the 16 million shades of color in my computer are due to the digital limitations of the microchip. We would need an infinite number of words in order to name every color tone, because underneath our subjective divisions, there are no individual units. It's one spectrum. The same is true of the measurement of distance and time. The millimeter and the nanosecond can be divided into even smaller units, and those can be divided again ad infinitum. All our attempts at defining the universe in terms of bits are foiled, because the universe is not ultimately made of units of stuff. Not even when you get right down to fundamental particles, because those particles are also waves depending on how you look at them. Let's now attempt to see the universe not as a vast collection of separate entities, but as a field where nothing is separate from anything, not even the division of mind from matter, nor the division of living matter from dead matter. Since life and consciousness both exist, we could refer to the universe as a superorganism engaged in a vast array of relationships with itself. First, understand that the human body is not a thing in itself. It is a series of relationships between bones, muscle, blood, and so forth. But notice how these relationships extend outward from the body into the environment. We tend to make the distinction between self and other at the point where our skin encloses our internal organs. But the body is just as dependent on the air entering it from outside as it is on the blood circulating inside. There is no fundamental separation. When I jump on my motorbike, in a very real sense, I become an organism that you might call the man bike for the duration of the ride. The nerves and sinews of my body interface with the cogs and wheels of the machine, and it all works together as a unity. It makes no difference that the rubber of the bike's seat is a separate substance from the denim of my jeans and the flesh of my legs. It all acts as one. Everything is inseparably interfaced with everything. Defining the self as the body is merely a common sense observation that falls away when we think a little deeper about what's really going on. If we define ourselves as our bodies, then we must define ourselves not as an organism, but as an organism environment. The two go together inseparably. And how far does this series of relationships extend? Well, the parts of my body are all dependent on each other. The body itself is dependent on the environment of the earth. The earth depends on the sun depends on the galaxy depends on the universe. Nothing truly exists in isolation from anything else. Our acts of labeling are merely a means of distinguishing aspects of a vast organism-environment field. This is the same in principle as the established understanding of time and space as inseparable. We may discuss space and time separately, but in each case we're unavoidably referring to what we know as space-time. Similarly, electricity and magnetism eventually had to be brought together and understood as two aspects of one force, electromagnetism. Practically speaking, your body cannot be separated from its environment, in the same way that it makes no sense to think of a red blood cell as distinct from the body it inhabits. So, if you wish to define the real you as your body, there is actually no you separate from everything. Consider bees and flowers. The flower produces nectar which the bee needs. While collecting it, the bee accidentally covers itself in the flower's pollen. When it moves on to another flower, some of this pollen is deposited, enabling the flower to reproduce. So, without bees, there would be no flowers, and without flowers, there would be no bees. We think of them as separate organisms, but there is no one without the other. The fact that there is atmosphere between them is quite arbitrary. An organism is really a series of interwoven relationships far more spread out than a tightly packed arrangement of internal organs. So a bee and a flower could actually be thought of as a single organism called the bee flower. The bee did not cause the flower, nor did the flower cause the bee. They evolved together and they remain codependent. The universe is not made of separate entities. It is one essence, consisting of a multitude of relationships wherein it experiences itself. Our common sense may resist perceiving the universe in this fashion, because we're so accustomed to thinking in terms of separate entities as a result of our Newtonian education. But even our understanding of atoms and molecules supports the non-dual perspective, if we think deeply enough about it. A human body can be reduced to a complex series of relationships between molecules, and the body's relationship with its environment is also a relationship of molecules to molecules. Air might be gaseous and invisible, but it's still there, and it's made of molecules, just like your body. It's easy to point at your body and say, "Here I am, this enclosed bag of meat and bones is me." Then you point at the woods and say, "That's not me, I'm over here, see?" But there is no you apart from the trees that give your body its oxygen. As we have already discussed, the function of the brain is to enable conscious experience. But since the brain is not a thing in itself, it is more accurate to state, a function of the universe is to enable conscious experience. The real mystery is how ordinary, dead matter can give rise to awareness. Those who think they can dismiss this profound puzzle with a wave of the hand are seriously kidding themselves. Maybe matter isn't quite as dead as it appears. Historically, there are two opposing philosophical positions regarding the question of what constitutes the prime reality, the foundational stuff of which the universe is made. These are called materialism and idealism. Materialists believe that matter is the prime reality and consciousness is a product of matter. Idealists believe that consciousness is the prime reality and matter is purely an experience of consciousness. There is, however, a third option called neutral monism. This is the idea that consciousness and matter should both be understood as manifestations of a singular essence. Materialists underplay consciousness as an emergent phenomenon within a fixed and solid universe, while idealists dismiss the universe as an insubstantial illusion of the mind. In trying to discover which one caused the other, we are failing to see that they actually go together inseparably. It's the old chicken and egg conundrum. Which came first? Neither, of course. They are really a single organism whose parts evolved together. Similarly, consciousness and the material universe are both manifestations of the mysterious stuff we call energy, and as such, they are inseparably one. There is no doubt, obviously, that stars and planets existed before human brains. Therefore, they must exist independently of human minds. But I don't intend to make the argument that human-like consciousness is as fundamental as physical matter. I propose that the energy of the universe is invested with a kind of non-localized primordial awareness, a basic drive to experience itself. In this model, the brain is not the generator of consciousness, but an aperture for it. A useful analogy is how a television set works. Pretend for a moment that you have no prior knowledge of the concept of broadcasting. You might mistakenly conclude that the TV set creates the program. It certainly appears that way to basic observation. You switch the set on, select the desired channel, and the set makes an episode of Breaking Bad for you. But is the program a component of the TV? No. The program exists as an invisible signal that is flowing through the world all around you, even passing through solid matter. The TV, connected to an aerial on top of your house, merely acts as an aperture, funneling the signal into itself and converting it into moving pictures and sounds. Similarly, there is a field of consciousness in potential that permeates the whole universe, and this field is focused into subject-object awareness by the brain. When we contemplate the enormity of a galaxy, a human brain seems extremely insignificant by comparison. This is certainly true if your measure of significance is size, but it's not true at all if your measure of significance is complexity. Our brain is the most complex structure that we have yet observed in the universe. Stars and planets, by comparison, are relatively simple in composition and behavior. A similar simplicity is observed in the microscopic realm, where we discover that all of the diverse forms of matter or energy in the universe are made from combinations of only 12 fundamental particles acted on by 4 fundamental forces. In between the microscopic and the cosmic is the grand spectacle of life on a terrestrial world. The complexity of life on Earth, and of humans in particular, gives us good reason to speculate that the function of the universe is to produce complex forms of consciousness on this world and others. This is not quite the same as saying God made mankind in his own image, but it looks as if the whole show might be for our benefit after all. Billions of years ago, the field of primordial awareness focused itself inside tiny clumps of cells. It was able to touch the world only in a very simplistic way. It could not yet do anything remotely comparable to what we call thinking. After numerous replications and mutations, some happy accidents allowed it to try out new interactions with the world. Mutations continued to happen, sometimes making life better, sometimes making it worse, and so began the evolutionary process. Eventually, after a staggering amount of trial and error, the primordial awareness ended up with a human brain and body around itself. And even though it now feels very advanced, all of the complexities of its elaborate awareness are merely outgrowths of that base urge of the universe to experience itself. Brain-centered consciousness is only one manifestation of the universe experiencing itself. Plants, for instance, have a consciousness of sorts, in that they are capable of perception and action. They are alive, just as we are. And when you look back far enough on the evolutionary family tree, animal and plant were one. We are essentially the same stuff. And when you get right down to it, we are all made of star stuff. There was a time in the universe's history when planets had not yet formed. The particles that later made up the stars are the same particles that formed your living body. With that in mind, who knows what strange forms of consciousness are evolving out there in distant galaxies? Is there any evidence for this non-localized primordial awareness? There is some, but unfortunately it is off the beaten track, in that oft-maligned area called parapsychology. Phenomena such as extrasensory perception and psychokinesis can best be explained by positing the existence of what we might call field consciousness, an interconnected field of awareness that permeates everything. I realize that is too large a leap for many readers to make at the moment. Psychic phenomena will be discussed at length in Part 3. Until then, hold that thought. Aside from the perceived lack of evidence, the best reason to embrace this view is the long-term lack of a solution to the hard problem. Non-local primordial awareness, as part of the fabric of space-time, provides an elegant theoretical answer. At its most basic level, consciousness is a phenomenon that arises when there is a perceptual relationship between I and not I. One cannot be conscious unless there is something to be conscious of. It takes two. The I feeling is not a physical or metaphysical mind or soul that can be located within the brain. It is not a thing in itself at all. What we experience as I is the universe focusing itself to an area of limited awareness through a lens. That lens is the human organism. The only real you is the universe as a whole. The only real anything is the universe as a whole. We can't find the self in the brain because it isn't there. Consciousness is simply the universe experiencing itself through the perception of separate forms. Examine the following two related statements carefully. 1. You are a focused area of limited awareness for the universe. 2. You are the universe focused to an area of limited awareness. The difference in the two statements is subtle but vastly important. The first makes the mistake of defining you as an entity separate from the whole. The second clarifies that the only fundamentally real you is the whole. Truly grasping this requires a profound shift in your sense of self that is alien to the Western mind and thus hard to integrate. Nevertheless, this model of consciousness provides an explanation for why we can't find it in the brain. It also fits perfectly with our deepest understanding about the nature of reality. Why is everyone still looking for a Newtonian explanation of consciousness when it has long been established that we're living in a quantum universe? When the universe is understood in this fashion, where nothing whatsoever is a thing in itself, then there is only one possible conclusion. You are it. Unfortunately, there is a lingering materialistic monism in the West. The universe, according to Newton, has been successfully replaced by a non-local quantum entangled universe. The key question to ask oneself at this point is, am I fundamentally real? If you answer with a yes, then you must conclude that you are the universe. Monism does not do parts. The fundamental reality is the unified whole. So if you're real, then you're the whole. No clauses, no exceptions. Any reference to parts is a return to outdated classical thinking. This conclusion generally seems to be unpalatable to those who insist on a materialistic view of the universe, and so they opt for the conclusion that consciousness is a brain-generated illusion. For the materialistic monist, this really is the only option left. But it's an absurdity, as we've already discussed. Monism is monism. It can't be thought of as materialistic at the expense of consciousness, or conscious at the expense of material. Since mind and matter are both real, then monism must include them both as one. While it is certainly true that the universe existed long before there were biological organisms wiggling around on suitable planets, the potential for conscious life had to already exist as a property of the universe from the beginning. Speculation is not necessary, for consciousness is, and like all else that is, we trace its origin to the singularity from which everything springs. In many respects, this is an automatic deterministic universe, since science has identified laws that operate on strict mathematical principles. But that's only half the story. It is also true that this is an unpredictable conscious universe, and you are it.